Okay, let me kick things off. So thank you very much for joining us for this fifth lecture as part of our IGC and BREAD Firms and Development course. We're very excited today to be moving on to topics related to capital and labor. So to put this into kind of perspective, in the first couple of lectures, we talked a lot about the technology side within the production function. Then we had an excellent lecture on misallocation, thinking about how factors, how inputs are maybe misallocated across firms. Today, we'll kind of dive into two of those key inputs, capital and labor. And then on Friday, tomorrow, we'll be thinking about intermediate inputs, materials, etc. when Rocco Machiavello will be talking about contracts. And today we're very delighted to have David McKenzie and Chris Woodruff give this lecture. I think they probably need no introduction. They've made many seminal contributions to the topics related to firms and development, and not least related to management, to supply chains, to property rights, and much more. But today they'll be talking about capital and labor, and where they have also had many path-breaking contributions, which I'm sure you'll hear about today. So let me hand over to them, and they'll be handling questions and answers as well. And remember, for the people who are live, please raise your hand if you have a question, and for others, enter on the Q&A, and one of David or Chris will answer on that. So thank you very much, and take it away, David and Chris.
Great. So yeah, welcome everyone. I'm David McKenzie. I'm going to start with labor, and then Chris will be able to answer any questions in the chat on the Q&A on this, and then if there's hands raised, let me know on that. So yeah, let me get started. So we're going to talk about the labor first, and then Chris will talk about capital. If you're a panelist, then I'll stop at a couple of points to see if there's questions, but otherwise just jump in if you have something very urgent to say. So let's make sure this is working. Great. So I'm going to talk about our firm's labor constrained. And so within that, I want to deconstruct three words to start with. And so the first is, what do we mean by firms? We've already seen that there's a lot of heterogeneity in firms. This, series is about firms, but there's just this whole range of different types of firms. And so when we ask if firms are labor constrained, it makes a big difference if we're talking about the most common type of firm in developing countries, if we're talking about these self-employed owners who don't have any paid workers, and we're asking, are they constrained in their growth by a lack of labor or by the availability of labor, versus if we talk about sort of small and growing enterprises that have a few workers and potentially would like to hire a few more, versus if we're talking about large factories. And so, we're going to look at the evidence on these different groups, but there's no single firm. We shouldn't write down a production function for a firm. The questions are going to be very different for each of these. Secondly, what do we mean by labor? We write down these macro models where we have F of K and L, but L here is not a homogeneous input. Some types of labor may not necessarily be substitutable. Even if we write some sort of CES function on labor, it may be that, even if we have 100 low-skilled educated workers, they can't do what one person with specialized skills may be. That, some things may be that there's just no substitutability whatsoever amongst types of labor. And so, when we're talking about firms being labor constrained or not, we need to distinguish the types of labor. And so, as a rough category, there's a mass of relatively low-skilled workers who firms might think of as interchangeable, just sort of being this labor input that we think about in the production function. There might be workers with very specialized skills that are, firms are looking for. And then we might also think about managers, and Jing Kai's lecture sort of talked about all the work on management, but we might also think about managers as a source of labor, as an input in this production function. Okay, so we need firms, we need labor, and then we need to know what we mean by constrained. And so, typically we write down this production function. We write sort of profits as F of A, K, and L minus their costs of labor and the cost of capital. And then you solve for the first order condition, and you're going to set the marginal productivity of labor equal to the wage rate. And so then we can think of sort of two definitions of what we mean by constrained. which we can also think of as analogous to financial constraints. So the first is that for some reason, firms cannot set the marginal productivity of labor equal to the wage, that they can't hire as much labor as they'd like at that market wage W. And so, this might seem strange to think about in developing countries. We often think developing countries are abundant with labor. There's lots of people looking for jobs. So why can't firms just find as much labor as they want? So, then we have to start thinking about, are there information frictions? Is it that firms don't know what the marginal productivity of labor would be? They're not sure if it would be profitable to hire this worker. There could be a lot of uncertainty about the cost side of it. And so it's, maybe that's a reason that firms are not able to set that marginal productivity of labor equal to the wage rate. We're going to talk about matching frictions. And so maybe, there's a worker out there who would be profitable for you to hire, but you just have trouble locating and finding them, and not all workers are substitutable. So I can't just get any worker. There's only specific workers that it's going to be useful for me to get. When we're talking about smaller firms, we might think about indivisibilities. We often think about that in terms of capital, but with labor, maybe I need workers don't want to come and work for me for 0.3 hours a day. I can't think of labor as this, completely continuous input, and there's sort of fixed costs with hiring each worker. And so maybe, for certain types of firms, that could be an issue. And then, this will link to the work that Chris is going to talk about. Maybe there's going to be financial constraints that make it hard for me to hire workers, either because work is a complements with certain types of capital. I run a small, tailor shop. I need a sewing machine for each worker that I bring on, and I can't. It sort of doesn't make sense to sort of hire a lot of workers without hiring the capital for them to use. Or maybe there's a bunch of upfront costs. These workers need some training before they become productive, and I am just liquidity constrained and can't afford to sort of pay those costs of training. So, there may be some reasons, and we're going to look at whether these are these constraints. But the second sort of definition of constraint might be sort of a more macro view that, that this developing country wage W is somehow too high or too distorted. And so, there's distortions in the economy that mean that even if I could set the marginal productivity of labor equal to that wage rate, that wage rate is somehow wrong for the economy. And so maybe it's wrong because, there's minimum wage laws that make it artificially high. And so, there's workers who would like to work for a lower wage and firms who would like to hire workers for a lower wage, but somehow they're constrained from doing so from these regulations, or there could be other regulations there. And if we think about some of these upfront training costs, maybe those, there's also this inability to pay negative wages upfront to people who are actually costly for me to have at first, and then productive down the line. So we'll come back to that towards the end, but to start with, we'll take the wage rate as given and sort of say, given the wage rate and the economy, can firms hire as much labor as they'd like to hire, or are there some distortions that prevent them from doing so? Okay, so with that overview, I want to start with these sort of different categories of firms. And so I'll start with the self-employed. I'll sort of go through, this is the most typical type of firm. And we've talked in this course already about, why are there so many small firms in the developing countries? And so one question is, are these tiny firms tiny because they just can't hire enough workers to grow? Is that sort of a constraint somehow? Is a lack of labor a constraint on the growth of these small firms? And so Chris and I worked with Suresh Damel to look at this in Sri Lanka in an experiment in which we tried to help firms take on an additional worker. So we started with these self-employed workers, and we gave firms a subsidy, which was in place for 8 months, which lowered the wage that they would pay. It sort of covered about half the cost to almost all of the costs of bringing on a worker. And then we tracked these firms with, almost 6 years of surveys, so that we can look at the impact and the dynamics and see whether, if we help firms, overcome these initial costs and hire a worker, is that going to help these firms grow? So, just to fix in your mind, what are we talking about when we talk about a firm like this? We focused here on male-owned enterprises. in Sri Lanka. We went door to door to find a lot of these firms, and there's sort of just a mix of the typical types of firms you might find in a developing country doing sort of retail, manufacturing, services. So as a couple of examples here, here's somebody who's doing shoe repair. The question is, would it help the growth of this firm if he were to take on another worker to help him, fix more shoes? And, is that the constraint that he's not able to get another worker? Or here's another person that's doing aquaculture, raising tropical fish. And, when we talk to them, they say, well, the problem is that if you just bring someone in off the street, all the fish will die because, it takes a bit of training to get the worker up to speed to be able to, manage the fish. And so maybe it would be profitable down the line, but, I'm not sure whether it would be profitable for me to take someone on initially until I've trained them up. And, so these firms are earning about $130 a month in profits. And, the question is, would they get more profits if they were able to hire some workers? And so, what would theory tell us? Well, our standard complete markets model, sort of a Lucas model, says that, firms are going to be setting their marginal products of labor and capital equal to these wage rates and the cost of capital. And so if we see these differences in employment size, if we see some firms don't have many workers, it's because this theta, this ability or this technology parameter, depending on what we've been calling it, is just low for these firms. These firms are not very productive. So if I see somebody who's very small, it's because they're not very productive, and they wouldn't actually benefit from hiring more workers. And so, the only way that they would benefit is if I make the cost of labor cheaper. And so this temporary wage subsidy is going to make the cost of labor cheaper. When an input's cheaper, I'm going to hire more of it. But as soon as that cost goes back up again, I will hire less of it. And so there should be sort of no long run impact of a wage subsidy. There should be a short run impact. When I make it cheaper, I'm going to hire more. And then when I remove that subsidy, I'm going to hire less. So then the question is, why might we think a subsidy would help these types of firms? And so, one reason is that there could be these frictions, these sort of search and matching frictions where I'm unsure of the types of workers. I'm this sort of person running tropical fish. I need to find someone I can trust who's not going to kill all my fish. It might be, hard to sort of find that person, and if it's costly to hire and fire them, I might not ever do it in the first place. And so what the subsidy allows me to do is sort of take a chance on a new worker, makes it less costly to test out somebody, and then if that turns out to be a good match, I'll keep them on. And even when the subsidy ends, there could be sort of long-term employment impacts. And so that would be sort of one reason, is if there's these search frictions and a subsidy helps me subsidize the cost of search. A second reason is that if I'm a small firm who's never hired workers before, I might not actually know, what the ability of my firm is, what the productivity of me as a business owner able to manage other workers is, until I try it out. And so, what I'll see is that there's some people who it would be profitable for this to do, who have never actually taken it out because they didn't know about their type. And so then with this wage subsidy, some of them get to learn. They get to learn that, yeah, my business actually can, be profitable with an extra worker, that I can manage these workers, and that, that I, therefore, even when the subsidy's gone, I actually now can set that marginal product of labor equal to the wage rate correctly with the right information that I didn't have before. And then, finally, there could be these sort of contracting constraints because of these training frictions that I talked about, where, many workers maybe are not productive in their first few weeks on the job, and then they're only productive down the line. And so, what we would typically do then would be to say, well, you should pay people their marginal product. When people first come, maybe their marginal product is very low or even negative. And so workers should be paying you to join your firm at the start, and then you should be paying them down the line. But if workers are very poor, or if there's minimum wage laws, or there's social norms, or these constraints here, then maybe you can't pay these workers these very low wages at the start. And so then, there's this constraint here. And then the subsidy of this wage subsidy can make it help you overcome those constraints and allow you as a firm owner to again, pay those training costs, get those workers up to the point where they're productive, and then even when the subsidy's gone, then these firms will still want to keep these workers. Okay, so what do we see in practice? We see that when this is the number of firms with a paid worker or the number of workers, and the black is the treatment group that gets the subsidy, the dotted line is the control group that does not. And so what we see is that when we give firms this subsidy, they hire more workers. And so the two groups we see this jump up in the treatment group in the number of workers. And then once the subsidy ends, which is the second one of these two vertical lines, then the firms start getting rid of some of these workers. They don't immediately get rid of all these workers, but over time, they just go back to where the control group is. And so, part of that is firms firing workers. Part of that is the sort of normal turnover where workers are quitting, but there's no long run impact of these wage subsidies. So for these sort of self-employed firms, getting this sort of short-term subsidy has no long run impact on the firm size, on the number of workers that these firms are holding. And so, then when we ask firms directly, why didn't you hire another worker, or what was going on here? They say, really most of them are saying, there's not enough demand. It wouldn't be profitable. I don't need another worker. This is sort of consistent with just a lot of these self-employed firms having an optimal size that's just very small, that it would not be efficient for them to take on another worker. And then, if we ask, is it that it takes time for them to become fully productive, despite the sort of, initial response of that fish owner, when most of them say, look, it takes at most 4 months, 6 months or shorter, it's not that long a time for workers to learn, what it takes to be productive in this firm. The subsidy that we offered was long enough to cover that learning period. And even with that, that's not overcoming issues for these firms. And then, when it comes to these search and matching costs, for a lot of these sort of small micro firms, a lot of the workers that they hire, it's really a lot of physical labor. It's not sort of complex tasks where it's very hard to ascertain those things. And they say, what I'm really looking for is, a worker of a certain gender and a certain physical strength. Those are the kind of key things. Education's not that important. Particular fine skills are not super important. And when we ask how long would it take you to find a worker, the median owner is saying a week. If I need to find a worker, I can find them in a week. So this again can, suggest that for these self-employed firms, it's not that costly to find workers, doesn't take that long to train them up. Really the market's actually working pretty well for labor for these types of firms. The constraint to these very small firms is not the lack of labor. It's not that they can't hire the workers that they would like. So let me take a quick check to see if there's any questions from anyone online at the end of the self-employed before we talk about different types of firms and different types of labor. Okay, great. So then, let me sort of add one other thing on this, which is just that really a lot of these micro firms, these small firms, have a lot of labor slack in them. That is, when you look at what the owners are doing all day, they have a bunch of time that they could actually be working a bit harder or doing a bit more. So even when you do other interventions, and Chris is going to talk about capital interventions, but I'm showing here, when we give business training, this is from sort of an overview paper that Chris and I and some others wrote for the Vox Dev Lit, looking at business training. Even when business training has increased firm profits, and so, here's a whole range of studies and the sort of increases in firm profits, and the average is a 12% increase in firm profits, the figure on the right showing what happens to employment. And so, we've got a whole lot of business training programs that have made these firms a little bit more productive, able to earn a bit higher profits, but there's a zero impact on employment, a very precise sort of zero impact on employment for these firms. And if you earn 12% more profits, you can do that by the owner working a bit more productively. They've got a bunch of space in their own time without them having to hire workers there. So firms need to sort of grow quite a bit before they start hitting the constraint that they need more labor. a lot of the time when you visit these small firms, the owner's standing around with no customers and without a lot to do. And, there's other constraints to their growth that are not just the lack of workers. And so I think, for a lot of these firms, we think that labor is going to bind later, and that there's other constraints that are hitting these firms first. So, that's the self-employed. What about, when we start looking at slightly larger firms? And so, let's first talk about slightly larger firms with non-specialized workers. And so on one hand, we should think that some of the frictions that I talked about should be a lot less of a concern for these larger firms. They should have more experience hiring workers. And so this idea that, I'm not sure about my type, I don't know what the marginal productivity of labor would be, should be much less of an issue if you're a bigger firm and you're constantly using workers. You should have a much better sense of sort of how productive is a worker going to be in my firm? How likely am I going to be to manage workers? So those things should be less of a constraint. Secondly, these search and matching frictions should be lower as well, because of this fixed cost of advertising for workers, or of sort of trying to find workers, of making myself known. If I'm a bigger firm and I'm doing more recruiting, then I can spread those fixed costs over more workers, and they should be, less of a constraint as well. So it should be sort of a little bit easier for me to find workers if I'm a bit bigger. And then similarly, these indivisibilities are much less of an issue if I'm, not the micro firm and I'm making this big jump from a 1-person firm to a 2-person firm. Going from a 9-person firm to a 10-person firm is much less of a jump. These indivisibilities shouldn't be there. But on the other hand, maybe we think that some of the sort of these regulations, these frictions around the minimum wage, the sort of issues of hiring and firing and things may be more severe as you get bigger and you get into the sort of legal eye of the government, where some of these things may bind a bit more. So I'm going to go through 4 cases that give us sort of a sense of, in different contexts, where this type of labor and these types of firms may or may not face different frictions. So the first is sort of one of the things that a lot of the research has been on, a sort of a big type of large factory in developing countries, are these large textile factories, which have been sort of a playground for a lot of the research that you might see through this course. They have these firms, sort of big employers. They have production lines with lots of data, and researchers have been looking at them a lot. And one of the things that I've taken from these studies is just how much turnover in labor there is in these factories. These factories sort of seem to have no trouble finding production line workers, but there's a lot of issues in holding on to them. That a lot of these workers sort of come into these firms and they leave very quickly, and within a couple of years, a lot of these workers have turned over. And so I want to point here to one study in Ethiopia, which Chris Blattman and Stefan Durkin did, where they worked in not just textiles, but in sort of 5 light manufacturing firms, including flour farm, shoe manufacturer, water bottling plant. And they have this great description in their paper where they sort of say workers are effectively disposable to firms. We can just think of them as an input that we can use like any other intermediate input. And firms really aren't that picky about these workers. And so in fact, they're so unpicky about these workers that they allowed these researchers to randomize which workers would come and join these firms. So this is sort of suggesting that firms are not particularly fussy about, the match quality, that they're, they say there's no shortage of applicants. There's lots of people applying for these jobs, and they're really indifferent as to which workers come and join these firms. But on the other hand, a third of these workers quit in the first month, and 77%, 3/4 of these workers are gone in the first year. And, the HR people say, well, because workers are coming and going all the time, we don't spend a lot of time, on that match. It's sort of a first come, first served. There's not much of an interview process. It doesn't take them very long to get up to speed. And so, we bring these workers in, they work, and then they go. And I think, we're seeing this a lot in these other sort of large studies from factories in India and Bangladesh, where I don't think there's a lot of trouble hiring workers, but there's things that firms could be doing that I think relate much more to these management practices that Jing Kai was talking about, of how do you have HR systems that are helping retain good workers and get rid of bad workers? How are you sort of upskilling your workers with training? How are you, doing things to hold on to workers that I think are less of a constraint on the labor side and more of a constraint on the management side? And so I think, again, I would point to, labor not being the binding constraint of the growth of these firms. Second sort of case of these larger firms that I want to talk about is sort of now talking about maybe trying to hire more educated workers. And so this is work that I did with some colleagues in Jordan, where we take a big sample again of SMEs in a whole range of different industries, and they're trying to fill sort of admin assistants, sales staff, accountants, marketing jobs, web development, IT. And so when you talk to these firms up front, they say, we have no shortage of applicants, but it's really hard to know who's good and who's bad. It's hard to find, competent graduates in reasonable proximity to the firm. And so we offered them a search and matching intervention where we took a lot of recent college graduates. We did psychometric testing, we did skills testing where they got, a computer test and an English test and an Excel test and things like that. So we could sort of, measure the skills for firms. We could measure the soft skills of firms and provide firms with this information. So you might think of firms that, really struggling to find the right workers, and you come and try and help them do so. Maybe this is going to help these firms grow. So what happened? Well, we made a whole lot of matches between workers who said they were looking for jobs and employers who said they were looking for workers. And very few of those matches ended up in interviews. Most of the time, firms said, actually, while we said we were interested, we're doing all right, we're not interested. And then when we found some of the workers who said they were looking for jobs said they weren't interested as well. And then once we got interviews to take place, very few of the firms hired those workers, and then most of those workers quit in the first month. And so, we made over 1,000 matches, and then, only 9 people out of that 1,000 ended up in jobs. And so, then when we look ex post to say what's going on, while firms tell you we have difficulty finding good matches, very few of them would be willing to pay to learn anything about the quality of graduates. And then when we track in a panel setting, how long does it take them to fill their positions? Have you got a position open today? We come back and ask what happened with that position. Most of those positions are filled within a month. Firms are filling these positions very quickly anyway. And basically what's happening is that firms say, well, we can fill these positions. We'd like to have better quality workers at the same wages that we're offering right now, but we're not willing to offer any different conditions. And I think, we'll come back to this towards the end. I think there's sort of broader distortions going on here in the macro economy, where the public sector means that, workers only want to work in certain types of firms, that the wage rate's sort of too high for the types of firms willing to, pay for these workers, but conditional on what the supply of labor is and what the wage is. Firms can find workers very quickly, and they can fill these positions. And so again, it seems like labor is not the constraint to the growth of these SMEs. So then we then talk to a third case, which is India, which is famous for these industrial laws that make it really hard to fire workers, particularly once you get to sort of 100 workers or more. And so you might think, okay, these firms surely are labor constrained. Surely now in a country like India, where there's all these regulations, these firms would really benefit from being able to hire a lot more workers, but these regulations get in the way and are a distortion. And so, here there's some very nice work by Shankar Shea and co-authors, which sort of point out maybe these regulations don't bind as much as we might think they do, because of firms finding loopholes, what he calls jacquard, where they're finding informal solutions to problems. And one of the solutions that's sort of arisen in India is this rapid development of a outsourcing industry where firms can contract workers through these third-party intermediaries, so they don't count for the purposes of the law. And so, this has really taken off over time. And so here, the x-axis shows employment, and the y-axis shows the proportion of their workers who are, these contracted workers. And once you sort of start getting to 100 or more, you're getting, 40, 50% of the workers in these factories are getting contracted through these these outside things. And so there's surely some distortion here, but the point of view is that when there are these distortions in the economy, the market is working to try and find solutions to these distortions. And so these distortions are not as binding as we might think they are. And again, maybe this is not the major constraint on the growth of these firms, because the market has come up with solutions that help firms get around some of these constraints. And so this is not to say it wouldn't be beneficial to remove these, change these laws or to make it a bit better, but conditional on the law, firms are still able to hire workers. They're just finding workers through these workarounds. So then let me, finish my, in terms of talking about these SMEs with one final case, which I think is one that shows where firms did seem to be labor constrained, which is from South Africa. And, this is a very unusual labor market. So in South Africa, the unemployment rate is, 20 to 25%. If we look at youth, it's, 40% or more. It's a market which is just definitely not clearing. It's a sort of mix of developed and developing country. There's very rigid labor laws that are perceived to make it very hard to hire and fire workers, but there's also very low informality. And so these workarounds that we see in India and other countries where, firms can get around the law are harder for firms to do. And so, this study looks at firms with 10 to 300 workers. That's, sort of an average of say 50, for a median of 50, mean of 78. So, much larger firms than I've been talking about with the micro ones. And then they give a treatment group a lot of information about the labor law and help these firms understand that the laws are not nearly as bad as they thought they were. And they find that when that's the case, these treated firms increase their hiring by about 11 workers or 13% over a 6-month period. So these firms are, do seem to be constrained by their fear of the law. They're not hiring as many workers as they want. And then when they learn that the law is not as bad, they do grow. And so there seems to be a constraint here. So this is a case with a sort of particular labor market, particular infrastructure, where it seems like firms are constrained and there's this misallocation that there's, these firms would be better off with more workers and there's this legal constraint. But one thing I wanted to point out here is sort of that a methods point here, which is, it very much depends on what you're measuring here. And even in this case, there's just a lot of churn going on. And so over 6 months, this x-axis shows how much churn and employment there was in these South African firms. And you can see some of these firms are, adding 350 workers and others are getting rid of 150 workers within that 6-month period. So this idea that, it's just impossible for these firms to change their number of workers very easily is not there in the data. These firms are making huge changes. And then, what this means for us doing studies is that if firms are making so much change in their workers and then we're doing an intervention, it's really hard to, detect a 2 or 3 or 4 worker change in workers from our intervention if firms are just making such big changes in their workforce anyway. And so you need a really big sample to be able to detect this. It also sort of says, well, is it really that hard for firms to change if they're changing that much? And then if these, so when they look at the change measured one way, they're seeing this big change. When they ask directly how much have you hired and how much have you fired, the impact that the study finds is much, much lower. Rather than 13 workers, they find 1 worker, which is not significant. And they say there's a lot of measurement error, but again, even in this context, it's going to be very dependent on how you're measuring this. And there's a question: are you just speeding up over 6 months hiring that you're going to do anyway? So even in this case, where it's this very unusual labor market, I think there's reasons to sort of ask how much of a constraint labor is here. So let me just check again if there's any questions from the online panelists.
Dave, one question that I couldn't answer on the chat is whether the results in South Africa were sustained over time, whether the additional hiring was sustained.
Yeah, and they can't answer that either because they only look 6 months down the line. And so this is my sort of last bullet point here is, is this just speeding up hiring that firms were planning on doing? Is this a sustained impact? So I think this is sort of an interesting counterpoint to my argument that most of the time this is not constrained, but we still don't know whether this is sort of having a long run impact in this case. Ridwan, you had a question?
Yes, thanks for letting me in. So my name is Ridwan. I'm from Delhi School of Economics. So I was just wondering that how does industry academia collaboration sort of help in removing the information frictions regarding the type of labor to hire? So what sort of impact does industry academia collaboration does have in terms of removing the information asymmetries about the matching you were talking about?
Yeah, and so I think this is where there's obviously a large labor matching industry already there that's trying to help firms do this, but researchers have come in with ideas of other ways to help workers signal their skills, and I think there are good opportunities to work to get together to try and improve that. But I think it's a little case specific. I'm going to talk about, I think, one or two cases. I think we've got two more questions from so Selva Champo. You want to go? Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name terribly. Selva or Umberto?
Hi, thank you. I would like to ask, are there any study that explore the relation between HR and manager practice and innovation outcome or effort?
Yeah, so that's again sort of pointing back to the sort of link between management practices rather than sort of labor and then innovation and growth. And I think there's a lot of some of the work that has been done on management has looked at more in developed countries at correlations between better management practices and more innovation and R&D. I don't know if things in developing countries that have sort of showed causally that link, and particularly with sort of HR practices. But again, I think this is and I'll come to this hopefully in my next couple of slides about the sort of types of workers. So let me try one more time. Is there any other panelists? There's someone with their hand raised who I called on. Do you want to talk? No. Okay. Well, let me move on, and then we can. I'll take others. So my sort of bottom line for this is that often I think labor is not the big constraint for low-skilled entry-level labor into these large firms, or for the self-employed. That many firms complain that it's hard to find workers, that it's hard to get them to stick around, but revealed preference suggests that actually firms fill most of these jobs very quickly. They choose not to spend a lot of time in screening. They don't employ a lot of HR practices to help their best workers, and they can often find lots of ways around regulations. And so it suggests these wedges are not that big, that firms are not devoting a lot of effort to doing it, that they don't seem to be really constrained for the most part. So then I want to sort of finish by saying, when might labor be more of an issue, more of a constraint to firm growth? And so I think one sort of category is with more unusual labor market institutions. And so we talked about South Africa. I think another system that sort of comes up is this apprenticeship system, and that's prevalent in some parts of the world, where it's this mix between a type of employment and also a type of education. And so this is a system where the wage paid is actually typically negative for a while. You're training people who will compete with you often when they've finished. And so we can think about various frictions that this type of system causes. And so there's work by Morgan Hardy and Jamie McClassen, who looks at this government program in Ghana, and they work with small firms and with poor unemployed people. And the constraint here is that these poor unemployed people can't afford to pay this fee to have negative wages at the start. And so instead of this fee, the government does a screening program, and it selects people who are are good amongst these types of workers who wouldn't normally be able to get selected by firms. And this does find that there's a group of firms who choose to be in this program who benefit in the short run from this type of help, that getting this additional type of labor who otherwise wouldn't be there on the market, or that they wouldn't be able to screen on the market, does seem to get some increase in profits. But there's a couple of other recent studies that have sort of looked at this apprenticeship environment that's finding while it helps the apprentices, it's not having measurable impacts on these firms in Uganda or in Cote d'Ivoire. So even in this apprenticeship case, it's not, you know, I think there's a lot of frictions on the side of the job seeker, but it's less clear that, you know, firms would really benefit from taking on a lot more of these apprentices. So then, you know, another type of constraint, I think, you know, we've talked about sort of less skilled, less specialized labor. I think with specialized labor and more growth-oriented SMEs, then these search frictions could be a lot higher. It could be harder for owners who are sort of these fast-growing firms to know whether it's useful to take on these types of labor. And so in work that I did with Steve Anderson in Nigeria, we looked at, you know, firms who are fast growing and when should they take on specialists in things like marketing or accounting or other professional functions. And, you know, do firms know how to find workers of these types? And so we subsidized them using HR firms and professional consultancies to perform these tasks. And we find that firms, you know, grow and benefit a lot more from having this help rather than trying to learn these skills themselves. But that there's a lot of search frictions that they wouldn't know how to find these workers by themselves, and they wouldn't know that it would be beneficial for them to do so. And so I think, you know, for these more specialized types of workers where firms haven't got a lot of experience doing it, maybe there's, you know, that can be a limit to their growth. And similarly, you might think of, you know, if I'm trying to search over space, if I need to hire someone from another region or another country, even I'm trying to export and I need specific workers that, you know if I'm in Jordan, how do I break into Germany? Like, you know, finding that worker, the search frictions could be quite high. And so there, you know, it's not to say that there's never any constraints on labor. The search frictions for particular types of labor could be high, but for the most part, I think it's not. So then let me just finish, you know, with, you know, I've talked a lot on the micro side, but I think, you know, we wanted to also take a step back and say on the macro side, you know, what we see is that given the current skill set of the labor force, given the sort of human capital of the country that we see and the wages that prevail in that country, many firms seem to be able to hire and fire as many workers as they like without a lot of constraint. But that's not to say that these countries and these firms couldn't do better if the supply of workers improves and if the price of workers was lower. And so, you know, one sort of interesting suggestion on this is this work that looks at whether labor is just too expensive in some countries. And so Galb and all have this work that sort of says a lot of African countries have wages that are much higher than you should expect given the level of income in these countries. And so it makes it hard for a lot of African firms to compete in light manufacturing. And you can point to sort of things like natural resource curses or sort of large state involvement in some cases to sort of explain why that might be the case. And so the idea here is actually, you know, the most constrained firms might be ones that don't even exist at all, that there should be, you know, a bunch of large manufacturing firms that just don't even exist in these economies because of the structure of these economies and the way that these economies are set up. It's just not efficient to do so. You know, another example is work on the high cost of middle managers, that because middle managers are so expensive in developing countries relative to the income levels in these countries, firms don't, it's not efficient for firms to hire a lot of these managers, and then, you know, through the management work that we've seen, that prevents firms from improving. And so, you know, I think this is a really interesting area for researchers to sort of think about this micro-macro interaction and how these sort of macro determinants of the wage structure in the economy filter through to, you know, whether there's constraints. And so I'm pretty much on time, I think. So I'll see if there's like one last question and then hand over to Chris. Okay, so we'll hand over to Chris, and then I can answer anything in the Q&A.
Great. Thanks, David. You can see my slides, I hope. So thanks, David. That was great and finished right on time. And I will try to pick up from where you've left off. I'm going to talk about the capital side of this, and it's going to be sort of similar in the sense of thinking about where there are frictions that might be leading to inefficient allocation of capital or too little capital. And I think when we think about this in the context of the literature that I'll spend most of my time talking about, we want to think about this as a constraint on the dynamics of firms, on the constraint on the growth of firms, and how whether capital is allocated efficiently in that sense. So let me first sort of step back and put this sort of in a broad context. There's we know that production in lower income countries is less capital intensive. A lot of this owes to labor being concentrated in smaller firms, as David Atkin showed in the data on in the introductory lecture. There's a seminal paper by Ragurajan and Luigi Zingales that shows that manufacturing in countries with weaker institutions more generally is disproportionately concentrated in low capital sectors. So it's a sector level analysis, not really not a firm level analysis. We might think of that channel as being primarily weak information, and they talk in particular about accounting standards, weak information and enforcement, weak capital markets, and then low capital intensity and smaller firms. So the theory, I'll put back up the David's theory slide to start with. I want to think about this in the same way, with the sort of Lucas model of an owner with some ability theta, and wanting to set the marginal product of labor equal to the wage rate and the marginal product of capital equal to the interest rate. And I've changed only the part that's in blue from David's slide to say that for any given theta, constraints to capital reduce firm size for a given ability. And this may be especially so for high ability entrepreneurs. And why do I say might be especially so for high ability owners or high ability entrepreneurs? Well, first thing to say is that's not always the case. If we had perfect capital markets and perfect insurance markets, interest rates are constant across entrepreneurs, and each borrows to the point where the marginal product of capital is equal to the interest rate. There wouldn't be differential constraint on high ability, high growth potential owners. But if either of those markets is missing or imperfect, which we certainly would think to be the case really realistically everywhere, but maybe especially so in lower income countries, then borrowing limits may be fixed, or credit might be limited by collateral, and since often external capital is limited to debt, when owners are risk averse and insurance markets are missing, that also may limit growth. So if it were the case that there were a very high correlation of ability and access to capital, this wouldn't be a problem. But the standard kind of thing that we think of people who have money but no ideas, and people who have ideas but no money, require that we somehow get the money from the people with money but lower quality ideas to the people with higher quality ideas but having less money, and that requires capital markets. And then that's where we start to think that maybe there's some constraints. So look, I'm gonna have 3 slides here with a bit of very, very basic theory on this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. I want really just to sort of draw out 2 points from them. One is, so we have owners of entrepreneurs, or owners will choose capital stock to maximize their utility, which is a function of consumption, and consumption is going to be a function of their income and their ability to, and less what they invest in less what they invest in the business. And the 2 key things to bring out here are what they invest in the business is going to be a function of constraints, and it's going to be in particular a function of borrowing constraints. as well as wealth constraints, wealth and income constraints. So that's basically equations 4, 5, and 6: the borrowing, the wealth, and the income constraints. The second thing to bring out is that risk is also going to play a role here, and the risk is going to, is when the owners are risk averse, we're going to see that also reduces how much capital they put in their they want to invest in their business. And I think that's another place where when I step back and say, let's look at the literature and what we've learned about how to resolve some of the constraints that we see in the how to make these capital markets, these external capital markets, work and function better. One of the places I want to point to is the idea of how do we bundle some sort of insurance, some sort of risk, a way to deal with risk at the same time that we're dealing with capital. I think that's an area where we're beginning to see some pretty interesting work, and we want to, I think we want to think about that a bit more carefully. So ignoring risk but allowing for imperfect credit markets, we're going to have the marginal product of capital not equal to the interest rate itself, but interest rate plus the shadow value of capital in other uses. That's a function of the liquidity constraints. But perfect credit markets aren't going to be enough. When we have missing insurance markets, we're going to have we're also going to have risk rationing or risk constraints for the entrepreneurs, and under reasonable assumptions, that's going to give us a marginal product of capital which is greater than the interest, which is greater than the interest rate. So again, sort of suggesting some sort of constraint, but the constraint's not coming from differential interest rates across entrepreneurs, but from the differential interest rates in the market across entrepreneurs, but from the differential risk-adjusted cost of borrowing. So with that in mind, with those two things in mind, that we want to think that there may be constraints which are in the capital market which are varying with the ability of the entrepreneur, and we want to think that there are potentially risk rationing or an additional constraint which comes from the fact that entrepreneurs have a large share of their wealth invested in a single firm and a single undiversified asset that may affect their willingness to make investments and their willingness to grow. And while David kind of talked about 5 papers, several minutes apiece, I'm going to talk about several papers a minute, but I'm going to try to bring those together around a couple of topics and papers that are quite closely related. A lot of the work that's gone on in this area especially with small firms and small and medium firms has been done through RCTs. The RCTs are often in a single context with a single sample. And, we want to learn across the RCTs about the patterns that we see in the data as we look at the results from several studies at the same time. So I've tried to group some of the studies. I'll dig into a couple of them that I think are particularly interesting and promising directions for the literature to go in a bit more detail, but I'll otherwise try to group some of these studies to talk about them. So the first two non-randomly selected examples of returns from grants. First, the project that David and I did with Suresh Damel again in Sri Lanka, where we gave capital grants of $100 to $200 to firms with that should say less than $1,000 in capital. So these are firms without paid employees who are on the small end of the spectrum, and we wanted to understand what's the return to capital in these firms. What we found was returns of around 6% per month on average across the whole sample, and that compares to microfinance rates in Sri Lanka at the time of 1.5% to 2% a month. So it suggests that returns are quite, the marginal product to capital is quite a lot above the market interest rate as measured by the interest rates of MFIs at the time. Similar design, similar kind of project work that David and I did with Marcel Faschamps and Simon Quinn, an RCT, similar sized businesses in Ghana, where we found that returns for cash grants were similar to the level in Sri Lanka. Returns to in-kind grants, in-kind meaning we purchased inventories or assets for the business owners that were the assets and inventories that they said they wanted to buy with the funds. Those returns were quite substantially higher in Ghana than the cash returns, but again, quite high returns to, suggesting quite high returns to capital, maybe especially if the capital is actually makes it fully into the business, as it was more likely to do in the in-kind grants in Ghana than with the cash grants. Then finally, the Banerjee et al. Project looking at loans in Hyderabad, India. They have a fairly, on the enterprise side, on how much do the loans affect the profits of businesses. They have a fairly noisy zero, so it's insignificant, but we wouldn't be able to rule out fairly large returns, but a fairly noisy zero on average. But high returns among those with enterprises that had enterprises before the loans were given. And I think that's the point the next point I want to make is that all three of these studies and a lot of the other literature that we see on capital grants shows a tremendous amount of heterogeneity, not only in the enterprises themselves. Of course, if we look at the enterprises in lower income countries, we see heterogeneity in the cross section, but we see a tremendous amount of heterogeneity in the returns to capital from the shocks that the experiments provide. And I'll show this in three different ways, in ways that are calculated in three different that are constructed in three different ways. First, from our Sri Lanka paper, where we have predicted returns based on characteristics that come out of a regression allowing for heterogeneity in return based on those characteristics. And those characteristics include whether the measures of the ability of the owner, not quite theta, because we don't have a perfect measure of theta, but fluid intelligence, digit span, numeracy, those kinds of ability measures, and liquidity constraints in the household, and in particular wage income in the household relative to the size of the business. We can see quite a large range of heterogeneity across returns in that returns to the capital grants in that project. Similarly, in Ghana, this is for males. I think the point that I'd make here is if we look at the green line, which is the in-kind equipment, purchased directly for the enterprises, what they want to buy. I think the thing that's striking about this figure is how far out the green line goes. That is, at the top of the distribution, there's really quite a lot of separation between the control group and the cash group, while at the bottom of the distribution, there's not much separation at all, again, suggesting a range of returns to capital that at the high end was quite high, and at the low end is close to zero. Banerjee et al. Find the same thing with their Indian data. This again with loans, what they term gung-ho entrepreneurs, but are the subsample of pre-existing entrepreneurs. In quantile regressions, kind of no effects up to about the 75th percentile, and then positive effects and really quite big effects from about the 85th or 90th percentile up. So in the upper tail of the distribution, quite substantial returns, even though not so much, the returns are not so high in the lower end of the distribution. So this shouldn't be a total surprise. Heterogeneity has long been a hallmark of the microenterprise sector. Lisa Petey has work on this back from the 1980s, talking about the heterogeneity in the sector itself. And similarly, if we look at venture capital firms, they typically make all their returns on a few superstar performers. Again, quite a lot of variance. A lot of firms lose money, but a few firms make a lot of money. And in some senses, what we see from the capital drops kinds of and even some of the loan kinds of papers is that sort of heterogeneity as well. One of the most consistent results where it's reported is what I've sort of just shown you in those graphs, is that the effects are concentrated in the top part of the distribution. And so I'll say this, and then I'll take Barbara's question here. An obvious challenge is that if they're concentrated in the top end of the distribution, we may lack enough power in the typical RCT to be able to sort of really sort of characterize that part of the distribution. Let me pause there, and Barbara, take your question.
Okay, thank you very much. So you mentioned that the firm owners' specific qualities could determine return to capital. What of specific country, business environment? How does that also affect return to capital?
So certainly that's going to affect returns to capital across the whole sector. In the very small enterprises that we're looking at in most of these experiments, and I would say the work that Dave and I have done in both in Mexico and in Ghana and in Sri Lanka, the work that I've referenced there in India, all very small, kind of almost mostly local neighborhood businesses, and maybe the overall business environment in the country is not going to have as big an effect on these enterprises as it would on. In a minute, I'll talk about about work with banks and loans that go up to much larger size businesses, as it would with those larger size businesses, where their growth is going to start to bring them into a regulatory structure and into the need to sell to a much more varied number of customers, and to work outside of their own more narrow networks and things of that sort, where the business environment is likely to play a much larger role. Okay, so let me push on. So I want to think about this. I want us to think a bit about this idea of heterogeneity and selection. I think there's been a tremendous amount of very interesting work that's gone on in this in this area, and I'll talk a bit about some of that that has gone on and is going on. First question we might ask ourselves is, do entrepreneurs self-select into sources of capital? That is, do the ones who have high returns to capital, are they the ones that apply for that are more likely to apply for loans and more likely to push to get loans? And the second question, which is related to this as well, is, can we identify those entrepreneurs with higher returns, and if so, how? And this is a place where I think there's been quite a lot of work that's that I find really quite interesting, that is and interesting and promising, and I think it's an area where there's more that can be done. So on the first question, the literature on standard credit contracts is somewhat mixed, and Jin Kai and others have a box dev lid on microcredit that sort of reviews this literature. Rachel Meager uses sort of a Bayesian hierarchical analysis to look at a collection of RCTs on microcredit, finds what people interpret as fairly weak effects of the credit on firms. It may have effects in other areas, but on firms and firm growth, relatively weak effects. But there are several papers that show somewhat larger effects on larger firms with bank loans, and I guess one of the first in this area, the Banerjee and Duflo paper from 2004, but that paper had been around as a working paper for quite a long time, so it really predates that. It really is one of the early pieces on this. Uses bank lending policy changes. There was more than one change where the law changed. The Indian government had set aside programs for firms below a certain size, and that threshold changed at different points in time. And so firms of a given size were intermittently eligible and not eligible for these loans. These are much bigger firms than the RCTs that I've just talked about. On the range, the thresholds were set at the ranges of $150,000 roughly given the rupee dollar exchange rate at the time, to about $700,000. So much larger than the ones that we talked about, and they find annual returns of about 100% a year. And they spend quite a lot of time convincing us that this is actually marginal capital, that this is not sort of substituting for other capital, that this is access to new capital. There's another current working paper by Jin Kai and Adam Seidel that is quite an interesting experiment with an RCT and a banking partner in China. Again, quite larger loans, quite larger companies, loans of up to $80,000. And the main point of their paper is to kind of look at the indirect effect of these loans. So they work in 78 retailer wholesaler markets in a single city in China, and they offer the loans at a slightly below market interest rate, so on favorable terms, but not ridiculously favorable terms, to either 80%, 50%, or 0% of the firms in a given market. And the variation between 80 and 50 in particular gives them the ability to look at what's the effect of a competitor of yours getting loans when you're in the control group in the same market where they were. I want to focus on the fact that they find quite a substantial, firm-specific effect. Now, it almost gets completely offset by the negative effects on competitors. So there's no market level effect of this credit, or there's not a very large market level effect of this credit, but there's a large firm-specific effect that suggests that an individual firm has quite a high return to an injection of capital in the firm. So the intention to treat sales increased by about 10 log points with 28% take up, for example. So quite a substantial increase in sales of the treated firms, which in the markets where other firms are not treated are offset to some extent by losses in sales of the other firms in those markets. A second project in this area, which I think is very interesting and promising in terms of thinking about how do we identify who the potential who the firms are that can potentially benefit from larger loans. Garrett Bryan, Dean Carlin, and Adam Osman have a project ultimately landed in Egypt after trying out in several different countries over a large number of years. But they work with the Alexandria Business Association to offer loans that are 4 times as large as the previous limits, borrowing limits of the association. So all at once, overnight, you're offered a loan which is 4 times larger than you could possibly have gotten prior to that. They find modest average effects for the larger loans, but they find quite an interesting pattern in heterogeneity. And I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about how they do this, because I think this is a paper and a technique and an approach which is interesting and promising, and one that where I think additional work would be merited and helpful. So first, they start with a sample of what is the experiment? What do they do? They start with a sample of previous borrowers who were selected by the loan officers of the ABA, of the Alexandria Business Association, for their potential as being able to absorb a much larger loan. So this is, they're using local knowledge of the loan officers to select these candidates for the larger loan. Within this subset, they asked, can the loan officers predict who will succeed? Well, it turns out not so well. In fact, there's no positive correlation between borrower performance with the standard loan and with the 4 times loan. So the experience I have, having lent to David, with the standard loan over the years, and seen what he does with this with the standard loan, that doesn't help me predict what he's going to do with a loan that's 4 times as big. It turns out that those performances are somewhat different. Instead, what they find is that the top performers with the larger loans are better predicted with psychometric and cognitive data that the ABA that they collect as researchers, but that the ABA does not collect. And in fact, most lenders don't typically collect. Although Azam Khwaja has some work in this area that has done things with the psychometric measures and these measures with lenders. So sometimes I think people are using these data. Instead, the type of firms doing best with loans are among the worst performers in the control group, suggesting that past performance is a poor predictor. And why? Well, the authors argue that all entrepreneurs are optimists, but some are really incredibly excessively optimistic. And the over-optimism pays for small loans because I can't get myself into too much trouble making these smaller investments. But once you give me a loan that's 4 times as big, I can get myself in trouble with making the wrong investment. And so what do they find? Well, first, what are they going to do? They'll take their data with the psychometric and cognitive data. They'll take the standard lending data that comes out of the loan files, past history, repayment rates, things of that sort. And then they're going to also do a version of this exercise where they take all the data they have, both the standard data and the psychometric data. And they're going to run a machine learning prediction exercise where they split the sample 50-50 into a training sample and a testing sample. And in the training sample, they're going to ask, what are the characteristics? What are the types of entrepreneurs who do well with the loan, right? So it's a bit like the graph I showed you from our Sri Lanka paper, where I've got the heterogeneity in returns based on, in that case, it was a standard regression, but regression with certain characteristics, right? This is going to be machine learning that's going to give me a prediction of what variables, what types predict high returns. They do that in the training set, and then they're going to run regressions, and they're going to show us the regressions on the testing set. So a completely different group of entrepreneurs. If what they were getting out of the training set was there by chance, we should expect it not to show up in the testing data. And so what they find is summarized on this graph. And I think Let me point to the one on the left, which uses only the psychometric and cognitive data. It's the only one where these results are statistically significant. But what they find is those who do the worst, entrepreneurs with characteristics that predict underperformance with the big loans actually lose quite substantial amounts on those investments. The loans make them worse off. Their profits are lower. They make risky investments that blow up and they lose money on them. The ones at the top end do phenomenally well and make very high returns. Notice that in the middle graph, which is the predictions that they would, the same exercise that they would do, 50-50 split, a training sample, a testing sample, trying to predict characteristics, types of entrepreneurs, using the data that the ABA has in its own files. They don't find that you still get this pattern of upward movement, but it's highly insignificant. So nothing that is statistically significantly different about what I can predict out of the loan files that tells me about who's gonna do well in this with these loans and who's not going to do well. So this kind of heterogeneity and this sort of exercise of how is it that we can try to predict who's going to do well with things. Now, you know, they're not the first to try to do this. And let me jump down to the bottom of the slide. There's work from business plan competitions where we see panelists trying to predict which types of firms will grow the most, and the experience there is more mixed in terms of what people are able to predict. But the broader area of kind of thinking about what's the heterogeneity and how can we reach that heterogeneity, how can we figure out what the heterogeneity is, I think is something that has a lot of potential, and it's still quite a young research area. Okay, let me pause there for a second and see if there are any questions. Okay, then I'll jump on to the next part of this, which is thinking about the other side of what I said. So that first bit was on the heterogeneity and how do we think about the heterogeneity of the owners and borrowers and who's going to gain the most from these loans. The second part I want to think about is, you know, risk rationing and thinking about flexibility of credit. And of course, business fortunes in any context vary quite a lot over time. We might think that's especially the case in lower income countries where things are often somewhat more where markets are sometimes more turbulent and more seasonal and things of that sort. So in the absence of the ability to insure against this type of variance, is a rigid debt contract optimal, where we have lots of variance? You know, I think finance theory would tell us this is a place where we should have equity, not debt. We should have debt that's, you know, more flexible, that allows flexibility. So I'm going to start here with thinking about that sort of more or less standard debt contracts that are tweaked in a way that makes them somewhat more flexible. And I think the first work in this area that, you know, arguably is the work that Erica Field and others did in India, where they conducted an RCT where the treatment group, the control group got a standard loan, and the treatment group got a loan that allowed them to make no payments for the first 2 months, a grace period. These were all second-time borrowers. It was group lending, and it was India. Barboni and Agarwal have a paper in India where they also offer flexibility to delay the payments for up to 3 months. That is to stop making payments on your loan for 3 months during the payment cycle at any point, not just at the beginning, but at any point. Individual loans, experienced borrowers, their idea was lots of these borrowers are in places where there are, say, festivals that have shocks to demand at a certain point in the year, and allowing them to delay payments during that time of the year gives them capital at a time when demand has kind of shifted out and the returns are quite high. Third paper in Bangladesh, again, offered flexibility to defer the loan payments twice during a 12-month cycle. Again, individual loans, again, experienced borrowers. And then a final paper by Brun et al. In Colombia, first-time borrowers, individual loans, 3 months where they were allowed to make interest payments only, not defer the whole loan. They still had to pay the principal, but interest payments only. They find, so what do we find? What do we find out of this? First of all, Field and all find that the grace period leads to much higher investment rates, very high returns, of about an 11% monthly return compounded, and that the capital in the business after a year is 82% higher. But they also find quite substantially higher default rates, so that it looks like it's not profitable for the MFI to offer that contract. But if you look across even those 4 studies that I've just written down there, you get a mixture of high risk, high return investments. That's true in Field and Battaglia. You get the ability to meet demand surges, as I talked about in Barboni and Agarwal, or you get no improvement at all. You get higher default, or you don't get higher default. There are differences that may be differences in the context. There may be differences whether it's group lending or individual lending. It may be differences in the types of borrowers, whether they're first time or experienced borrowers and things like that. Again, this seems like an area where digging in to try to understand who benefits from the flexibility of the loans and who is it who may not benefit is a ripe area that we might think about kind of doing something more systematic with. Are there differences in the design of clients? Is there predictable heterogeneity? This paper by Crepon, El-Komi, and Osman sort of says that, look, there's more heterogeneity within any of these samples than there is across samples, and it's really there that they need to be looking, and that's kind of what I want to say. Okay, in the last few minutes that I have, I want to say a bit more about thinking about pushing the debt, this sort of flexible debt contract even further, to kind of pushing it towards something that looks more like an equity contract. And I'll talk about one paper one pilot of an experiment that David Suresh and I did in Sri Lanka, which I think of as kind of a failed experiment, attempting to make a leap into microequity contracts. So we took a series of nine enterprises and invested $5,000 on a royalty-based revenue sharing contract in lieu of fixed payments. So not share of profits. We knew better than to try to figure out what the profits of these businesses were, but share of revenues. Turns out that's also pretty hard to figure out and monitor. The principal can be paid partly through the royalty rate, and we set up sort of the contract where it was flexible that these with choice of parameters, you could make it more equity-like or more debt-like. The failure actually didn't come as much from underreporting of royalties as it did just from the inability to enforce non-repayment. It turns out that the Sri Lankan legal institutions didn't recognize the contract as collateralizable. They didn't recognize it as a debt contract. It was an innovation that required a sort of change in the legal structure that wasn't that made it difficult to enforce in the courts. So that was perhaps a leap too far towards the equity direction, but there are a couple papers out there that I find interesting in this area, and I think they're again, it's a place where the literature is ripe for more innovation and more experimentation with what we might get to work to bring in sort of more risk sharing into the external credit. So one paper, Bari et al. Works with an MFI in Pakistan that offers a rental contract, and it is for large lumpy assets. So think of like a three-wheeler or something like that, where the borrower has the right at any point to return the asset to the lender, and you know, in that case they've lost their rental payments that they've made to that point, but it's rent to own. So after a certain period of time, when they've made a sufficient number of rental payments, the asset is they fully own the asset. Their share of ownership starts at 10%, and then each time they make a payment, it increases until they've bought the entire asset. So there's some risk, some insurance here in the sense that they're able to return the asset. Kadara et al., similar sort of thing with bicycles in Kenya, where the payments are linked to measurable sales. They work with a candy company food company that where they have the wholesale data that allows them to say what the actual sales are and measure that quite carefully. These royalty-based contracts are not so uncommon in venture capital. There's a Nigerian company called Move that makes loans to Uber drivers that also uses a similar sort of royalty-based contract. So a few concluding thoughts. First, a couple of takeaways. There's a lot of interesting work scraping information to aid targeting and selection. I think there's a lot more that can be done in this area, but that's a place thinking about this heterogeneity of entrepreneurs and how do we target this better. The second is that debt's almost certainly not the first best external credit instrument. It may be the second best, and it may be the best we can do in lots of contexts, but moving to more equity-like instruments and figuring out how to do that, how to push that down the size chain, I think is an area that's quite interesting. In both cases, I think we'd do well to look at what venture capitalists are doing and say, how can we do that with smaller firms? And perhaps with machine learning and computational capabilities, these opportunities will open up to be able to do this at scale on a smaller firm. The last thing I want to say is there's not enough time. This was far too focused on small firms and debt to justify the full agenda that's here on capital and firms. I needed to say more about angel and venture capital finance and investment readiness and other potential high flyers. So I'll just point to the work on accelerators that Juanita Gonzalez-Uribe and others are and some of her collaborators are doing, which I think is a promising area with sort of faster growth firms, and then some work on investment readiness that David and others have done in the Balkans, kind of thinking about how we get firms ready to scale up. And I'll stop there. I think we've got about 2 minutes, and I see Umema has a question. So let me.
Yes. Hi there. So I have a question that in these RCTs experiments, especially where the firms have been given the flexible time of borrowing, do you experience like there is a correlation between a higher default rate and their productivity? Like, is it necessary that these firms, if they default more on their loans, are they more productive, or yeah, so is it the same productivity, or are there any other barriers that are affecting these default rates? Thank you.
So the one experiment that finds higher default rates is the Field et al. Project in India. The others don't find higher default rates than in the standard contract. And in the Field et al. Paper, as I recall, it's the people who default are the ones who decide, I've grown big enough that I'm never going to have to get loans from you again, and therefore the relationship doesn't matter as much to me. So that would suggest that they're likely to be the high ability entrepreneurs. I mean, let me say that in general, there's one of the constraints, and it's the constraint that Garrett Bryan and Dean Carlin and Adam Osman went after, is that there's a sense that that growing out of a micro enterprise, out of a micro lender is difficult, because the best borrowers for micro lenders are borrowers that the micro lender wants to hold on to. Those micro lenders typically in most countries are not part of credit bureaus, so nobody else knows what your repayment rates are except the micro lender. And part of what they were trying to do was figure out how can we get micro lenders to pass off their clients to sort of more formal lenders. That's initially what they tried to do, until they found the MFI that would scale up the loans within the MFI. But I think that does suggest that these high ability businesses that are borrowing from these at some point they may feel like they're self-sustaining, they don't need external credit, and then it may be that's when they say, look, this relationship is not important to me anymore, and it might increase my chances of defaulting. But I think that margin is also one where there's a sense that there are challenges, let's say, in the way the capital markets work going across that barrier. Okay, I'm out of time. We're out of time. Let me close up here and just remind everybody that first of all, thank you all for participating, for joining. Remind you that the next lecture will be tomorrow at the same time. Rocco Machiavello will talk about contracting issues at the same time. So thank you all. Thank you, David and Dave, for organizing this, and good evening, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are.
Good morning from Boston. Thanks again, Chris. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, David.